Multiple ways for us to learn from someone's example. Over the course of the past 40 years, I have had both the privilege and the responsibility of contributing to the training of numerous interns and junior staff members, as it were, as their supervisor in terms of their preparation for ministry. And one of the things that I've always told these young people was that they should learn from watching me. And there are two ways I always told them that they could learn by watching me. One, they could watch me, and after having watched me, they could say, "That's really good. That's the way I want to do it." And two, they could watch me and say to themselves, "That's not so good. That's not the way I'll do it." And I always told them in connection with this talk that it would be in their best interest not to ever tell me how they were learning something from me in the second way, or they would no longer be an intern. Now, our messages this summer are from the Old Testament, and we're calling it Old Testament Characters. And each Sunday, we're looking at a character from the Old Testament. And we're using this word character because character doesn't necessarily mean something bad. There are some good examples we're looking at. But sometimes this word character implies someone who's not so good. And we're also looking at some people who give us a bad example. And today, the character that we're going to look at, we want to learn from in the second way that I will always tell our interns, "That's not so good. That's not the way I'll do it." We're going to look at a military man whose name is Naaman, and we can learn much from him. Now, the account of Naaman is in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 18. And since we don't have the overhead working today, if you have your Bible, I hope you'll open to 2 Kings chapter 5, or if you have the application on your phone or your iPad or whatever, we're going to go through these 18 verses, and even if you don't have a Bible, I'm going to read them. And let's get the story of Naaman before us. In verse 1 of 2 Kings 5, we're introduced to this character. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now we learn here that Naaman was a highly respected commander in the Aramean, or more familiar to us, the Syrian. Syria, Aram is the same country, army. And Syria, or Aram, was a neighboring country, and we just touched upon this last week, who periodically or regularly attacked their neighbor, Israel, and we're going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, the reason I've entitled today's talk, Mistakes of a Military Man, is because Naaman was in the military. And through this title, I'm in no way criticizing military personnel in general. I have the greatest respect and admiration and gratitude for those who have served and who are presently serving in any of the branches of the armed service for our nation. Now, the reality is, I was never in the military, at least the normal military. But I've always sung with pride that old children's song that declares, "I may never march in the infantry," or ride in the cavalry, have you seen this? Or soar o'er the enemy. I may never fly, but I am in the Lord's army. And one of the great privileges all of us have in terms of being followers of Jesus, and one image in the Bible, is to be in the Lord's army. Now, Naaman, our character for today, has an impressive resume with a distinguished career, but as remarkable as he was, he has a problem. He has leprosy. And leprosy is a general term in the Bible for a variety of skin conditions or diseases, but generally in the Bible it refers to a terrible disease that had no cure and that was usually terminal. Matter of fact, in Israel, lepers were quarantined because it was highly contagious, and as they traveled from place to place, they had to call out a warning, "Unclean, unclean," so no one would get close to them and perhaps contract this disease. Now, verses 2 and 3 tell us how Naaman had his hope raised for a potential cure. Now, bands of raiders from Aram or Syria had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel. That's almost out of today's headlines, isn't it? And she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, that would be Naaman's wife, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So in one of these attacks, they had taken this young lady, and she had become really the servant of Naaman's wife, and she knows of somebody in Israel who has the ability or the God-given gift of bringing healing to people. So in verses 4 to 6, we read how Naaman makes plans to go visit. Naaman went to his master, that would be the king, that's who he reported to, and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter, I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." Now in verse 7, we're told about the king of Israel's response. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me?" The king of Israel thought this was a ploy to have another reason to attack Israel. But then notice in verse 8 about Elisha's response to this. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." See, the letter from the king of Syria upset the king of Israel, but it didn't upset Elisha at all. And so verses 9 and 10 tell us about Naaman's visit to Elisha and Elisha's suggestion. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Now notice Elisha didn't even go, but sent his servant. So verses 11 and 12 tell us about Naaman's response to Elisha's instructions through his servant. But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Now, I want us to see that Naaman, I'm sure he later on is grateful for, has some very wise servants working for him. And notice the advice that they give in verses 13 and 14. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and he became clean like that of a baby. Can you imagine this seasoned military man finally going into the river Jordan? When he dunked himself 2 or 3 times, and the leprosy was still there. He looks with a glare at his servants, dips himself 2 or 3 more times, and it's still there. He's not happy. And then he dips himself the 7th time. And when he comes up, the leprosy is gone. And now, instead of glaring at those servants who encouraged him to do this, I think he had to be thanking them. Look at verses 15 to 18 that give us the final exchange here. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. If you will not, said Naaman, now look at this request from this military man. Please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. Naaman said, I got to do this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. I mean, he's converted. He wants to worship the God of Israel. So much so that he's taking dirt from Israel back home so he has a place to worship God. And he wants Elisha to know this one thing. He still reports to the king. And the king still is going to worship Rimmon in the temple, and he has to go there. And if he falls on him or leans on him and he's down on his knees, don't anybody think he's worshiping there, because he's not. Now, I want to advertise for next week at this point. Notice that after he's healed, Naaman wants to pay. We're going to talk about this some more in a moment. Elisha for this healing, and Elijah won't have anything to do with it. Next week, I want to pick up right here with Elisha's servant, whose name is Gehazi. And he is a man who's grabbed by greed. But today, let's look at some mistakes that Naaman made. And the first one is he thought he could buy cleansing. We see that both in the beginning, as he prepared to leave Syria, as well as after he had healed, when he was getting ready to leave. He loaded up with gifts as he left Syria, and following his healing, he tried to actually pay Elisha. And unfortunately, there's still those today who think they can buy the blessings of God. And if it's not taught clearly, it is at least implied by so many Bible teachers, many of whom we hear on the radio or watch on TV, who talk about that offering that you send in. That's going to be a seed of faith that will result in tremendous blessings coming to you. And while they may never say it, the suggestion is you can buy, you can give, with the goal of receiving a blessing from God. But neither God's blessing nor his salvation can be earned or bought. Naaman couldn't do it then, and no one can do it today. Now, don't misunderstand. That is not to suggest that we cannot put ourselves in a position in which we're likely to be blessed. God tells us in his word how to live a life to be blessed by him. But we don't earn the blessing by putting ourselves in that position. We put ourselves in that position and receive God's blessing because we have done and are doing what he's asked us to do. And we can give generously, not to buy God's blessing, but returning to God gifts as an expression of gratitude for the blessings that he has bestowed upon us, not the least of which is the forgiveness of our sins and the privilege to be called his child. Now, another mistake that Naaman made was that he went to the wrong place or the wrong person. Isn't it interesting that this girl that they had captured, who was working for Naaman's wife, told Naaman's wife about a prophet in Israel who could heal? But the king of Syria didn't tell Naaman to go visit the prophet. He sent a letter with Naaman to the king of Israel, and that's where Naaman went and delivered this letter. And that upset the king of Israel because he knew he wasn't in a position to provide what Naaman was asking for, let alone his master. The king of Israel was right to be frightened. Perhaps the king of Syria thought that the king of Israel would order the prophet to heal Naaman. But the king of Israel knew that not only he could not heal Naaman himself, he could not order the man of God to do anything. You know, people today still go to all kinds of the wrong places and the wrong people for help. The basic idea was suggested a number of years ago in a song that I never completely understood when it talked about looking for love in all the wrong places. And people are looking for help. People are looking for blessing and healing in all the wrong places. And I think Chuck Swindoll gives us some good advice still today when he cautions, beware of any human being who even hints at having special power from God or secret knowledge of his ways. Third mistake Naaman made was he became angry with the instructions of the man of God. You may have noted it as we read the verses earlier. In verse 11, Naaman became angry and stalked away. That's when Elisha didn't come out but sent out his servant. And then later in verse 12, so Naaman turned and went away in rage. I think he was angry because Elisha did not come out to meet him, that Elijah sent his messenger. I think he was angry at the instructions that Gehazi is who this was, that Gehazi, Elisha's messenger, gave to Naaman. He was angry about that. I'm pretty sure his pride was wounded. Aren't you? I mean, he thought he was pretty important, pretty big man in the army in Syria, and probably thought that the prophet Elisha ought to be impressed with him. I hesitate to compare myself to Elisha, but through the years, a lot of people have become angry with me and the instructions of God that I've tried to relay to them as a pastor. Sometimes people become angry with me because they think they're important, and I should be impressed because of the church they came from in coming here, or the experience that they had, or because of their education, or their position, or their power, or their money. And most of the time, rather than being impressed by people who think that I should be impressed by them, I'm put off by them. Several years ago, the mayor of Moreno Valley was a part of our church many, many years ago. Most of you don't remember this. And I forget one time before he was moving on, he came to me and said, I really appreciate the fact that you haven't treated me any differently than anyone else. And that really would be my goal, not to be overly impressed with anyone, but to be impressed by everyone that God sends to us. But more than the anger with the man of God, people today like Naaman then still become angry with the instructions of God. Now, Bible teachers and pastors today, myself included, do not have this link with God that Elisha the prophet had, but we still do have God's instructions here in his word. And it is not our prerogative to change what God has said in his word. And so I do my best to let people be angry, not with me, but to let them be angry with God if they're going to be angry at his instructions. And so this brings us to another mistake of Naaman, his fourth one. He had a preconceived idea of how the cleansing would take place. I mean, did you notice that as I read the narrative earlier? Naaman said, I thought he surely would come out to meet me. I mean, that humiliated him. I expected him to wave his hand over me, and the leprosy, as he called on the name of the Lord, God would heal me. And that still happens today. And coming to the Lord, or coming to his word, or coming to a church, people have preconceived ideas of how God operates. But God doesn't do things the way we think he should or will do them. I love the words of God through the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, God says, my thoughts are completely different than yours, and my ways far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Naaman's final mistake was that he wanted to make substitutions and changes in the commands of God. Remember, if he was going to dip himself in a river, if that was the way to be healed, then the rivers in his homeland of Syria were better than the Jordan River in Israel. It's as though Naaman thought, I want cleansing, I want healing, and I want it on my terms and in my way. Not too different from what people say in response to God's instructions still today. They want things on their terms and in their own way. And it's as though they think they know better than God does. When it comes to expressing one's faith with regard to the obedience of Jesus and Christian baptism, some people want to make changes in the instructions of the Lord. But Jesus told us to baptize believers into His name, following His example. And if you have never been baptized into Christ, you've never expressed your faith by symbolically acting out His death, burial, and resurrection in Christian baptism, I want you to know that we have a baptism scheduled for September the 21st. That'll be my last opportunity to do baptisms here at Discovery. And if you've never been baptized, I hope you'll give serious consideration to doing what Jesus has asked you to do to show and express your faith in Him. But when it comes to making a commitment to a local church body and carrying out that commitment as a member, some people want to make changes in the instructions of the Lord. They just want to come and go as they please. But God has called us to commit to a local body. And if you have never officially become a member of the body of Christ here at Discovery, Pastor Dan is going to be offering his first membership class on 4 Sunday mornings starting in a couple of weeks during this 9:30 hour. You could come to the 8 o'clock service and then go to the class. You could go to the class at 9:30 and then come to the 11 o'clock service. And there's a special class for children who would be here for 2 services during that time. When it comes to living a life of integrity and honesty, I mean, with regard to our taxes and things like that, some people want to make changes with regard to the instructions of the Lord. Or when it comes to honoring God through regular, consistent, generous giving of one's financial resources to honor the Lord and provide for His work through the local church, some people want to make changes in God's instructions. Or when it comes to enjoying God's beautiful gift of sex within the covenant commitment of marriage, some people want to make changes with regard to God's instructions. Or when it comes to growing as a follower of Jesus Christ through regular worship and consistent Bible reading and prayer and fellowship with believers, some people want to make changes, and we are not left with the prerogative to change the instructions that God has given us in His Word. Now, those are the 5 mistakes that Naaman made, and so I wrap this up. I want to suggest some abiding lessons for us today from that. And the first one is we have to realize our need for salvation if we've never come to Christ, for growth as a follower of Jesus, to improve and bear fruit as His follower. Whatever the area of need is in our life, we have to realize we have a need. Where is the leprosy, as it were, in your life this morning? Where you need help with regard to becoming more and more the kind of person that Jesus Christ has saved you to be. What's holding you back? You have to realize the need to make the changes. And secondly, we have to go to the right person and the right place. And that, of course, is God and His Word. Sometimes God does speak to us and give us guidance through His people. But if we're hearing from another person, we better be sure that that person is getting his or her information from the Lord and not from himself or herself. Third, then, we need to hear the Lord's instruction and the Lord's direction. Admittedly, that's not always easy, but that is what is needed. We have to be careful about putting our preconceived ideas on things or trying to change or substitute what God would say to us with regard to moving forward in His direction. I have struggled with that a little bit over the last few months. What does God want me to do? And so far, I have no clear direction. But I want to keep asking the question, will you, Father, point me in the direction? Will you give me instruction for where you want me to go? And finally, we need to follow the advice of Nike, the great sports equipment company and clothing and shoes, and that is just do it. When God reveals his will to us, we need to do it. Now, you realize this morning, I hope, how dangerously close to going back to Syria and living the rest of his life as a leper Naaman was. And if he went back, not having been healed, it would have been because of his pride and his stubborn unwillingness to follow the instructions of the Lord. And the challenge for us today is to not let our pride or stubbornness or anything else get in the way of our response to the Lord. As the band comes, I'm 63 years old now, and as I look back over my life, there have been a few family outings and vacations and church fellowship activities and other things that I have ruined for others and not made the best that they could have been even for me because of my stubborn pride and unwillingness. And I hope all of us can learn this morning from the bad example of Naaman, not to make these mistakes that he made, but to realize our need, to go to the right place, to get the instruction, and then just do it. The great theologian Augustine suggested many years ago, God without us will not, and we without God cannot. See, without us, without our response, God will not do it for us. And us without God cannot do it. Without us, without our response, God will not save us. He will not change us. He will not grow us. He will not transform us. He will not make us fruitful. But we without God cannot save ourselves, cannot change ourselves, cannot grow ourselves, cannot transform ourselves and become fruitful as he's called us to. It's all the work of God, but God requires us to respond.